A man who lives a lie wakes up with a truth that isn't his. Julian Croft, a brilliant art forger hiding under the assumed identity of Alex Mercer, survives a freak accident only to find his mind colonized by the memories of a murdered woman. These aren't just flashbacks. They are the vivid, terrifying last moments of her life, a psychic bleed imprinting itself onto his consciousness. Now, he must use his forger's meticulous eye for detail to solve her murder before her memories completely overwrite his own, and before her killer realizes the last witness to his crime has found a new voice. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The man who called himself Alex Mercer lived a life painted in shades of gray. His existence was a carefully constructed forgery, a masterpiece of monotony designed to be utterly forgettable. His one-bedroom apartment on the west side of the city was a testament to this philosophy. The walls were a neutral beige, the furniture was functional and cheap, and there were no photographs, no souvenirs, no personal touches that could betray the ghost who lived there. The only object of any real value was a small, exquisitely detailed landscape painting hanging opposite his bed, a perfect imitation of a 17th century Dutch master, a private joke that only he understood. It was a reminder of who he used to be, Julian Croft, arguably one of the best art forgers of his generation. Julian's mornings were a ritual of paranoia. He'd wake not to an alarm, but to the first gray light of dawn, his senses already on high alert. He'd check the 2 deadbolts on his door, peer through the peephole, and scan the street below for any unfamiliar cars that had been parked overnight. His phone was a cheap, disposable burner. His laptop's hard drive was encrypted 3 times over, and he paid for everything in cash. At his job, stacking shelves at a cavernous, soul-crushing big-box store, he was Alex, a quiet, reliable employee who kept to himself, a man whose backstory was as bland and unremarkable as the beige walls of his apartment. He was a master of imitation, and his current role was the most important of his life, an average, invisible man. This meticulous control was his shield. A deal in Chicago had gone sour, a client had gotten greedy, and Julian had been forced to vanish, leaving behind a life of high-stakes deception for one of quiet desperation. He was a non-violent man caught in a violent world, his only crime the uncanny ability to replicate genius. Now, that genius was focused entirely on survival, on maintaining the fragile fiction of Alex Mercer. That evening, the city air was thick with the promise of rain. Julian was walking home, his mind a tangled mess of anxiety. The quarterly inventory at the store had been grueling, and his guard was down, his thoughts drifting back to the smell of linseed oil and turpentine, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He was so lost in this nostalgic haze that he didn't see the cyclist until it was too late. There was a frantic shout, the screech of robber on pavement, but Julian's reflexes, dulled by months of monotonous labor, failed him. He turned his head just in time to see the blur of motion. He didn't even register the impact of the cyclist. His head connected with something far harder, a decorative cast-iron bollard at the edge of the sidewalk. The world fractured into a kaleidoscope of pain and light. The last thing he saw was the ornate, rain-slicked facade of a luxury condominium building, its windows like 1,000 unblinking eyes staring down at him. Then there was only darkness, a deep and silent void. He awoke to the smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic, metronomic beep of a machine. A fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the ceiling tiles. He was in a hospital. A woman in blue scrubs with a kind, tired face was checking the IV drip in his arm. "Welcome back," she said, her voice calm and professional. "You gave us quite a scare. I'm Dr. Lena Hansen. You took a nasty blow to the head. You have a severe concussion." He tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick and clumsy. "Alex," he managed, the name feeling foreign and distant on his lips, like a word he'd learned in a language he no longer spoke. "That's right, Mr. Mercer," she said, smiling reassuringly. "Your ID was in your wallet. We're going to keep you for observation, but you should be okay. You might experience some confusion, memory gaps, headaches. It's all part of the process." He nodded, the simple motion sending a spike of pain through his skull. He closed his eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of the accident. The cyclist, the shouting, the iron post. It was there, but it was foggy, muted. Yet as he lay there, another image surfaced, unbidden and unnervingly clear. It wasn't a memory of the accident, or his life, or anything he could place. It was the distinct, bitter taste of expensive dark roast coffee, the kind he never drank. And with it, a sensation that was utterly alien, the feeling of typing rapidly on a sleek laptop keyboard, his fingers tipped with long, perfectly manicured nails painted a deep, glossy crimson. The hospital released him 2 days later with a pamphlet on post-concussive syndrome and a prescription for painkillers. Dr. Hansen's parting words echoed in his ears. "Don't be surprised if your brain plays tricks on you. Confabulation is common. You might invent memories or feel like things are out of place. Just rest." Julian clung to that diagnosis like a life raft: confabulation. His brain was simply misfiring, stitching together random sensory data into false memories. It was a logical, medical explanation, and Julian, a man who survived on logic, desperately needed one. He returned to his gray apartment, the sanctuary he'd built against the world, but the walls no longer felt secure. They felt like they were closing in. The trickle began that first night. As he lay in bed, staring at his forged Dutch masterpiece, a scent flooded his senses. It wasn't the stale, recycled air of his apartment. It was a complex, floral perfume, jasmine and rose with a hint of something sharp and citrusy. It was expensive, elegant, and overwhelmingly female. He sat bolt upright, sniffing the air, but there was nothing there. It was in his head. The next morning, as he pulled on his worn-out work boots, he was hit by a wave of phantom sensation. The feeling of his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet, balanced precariously on 4-inch stilettos. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He remembered the satisfying click-clack sound those heels made on a polished marble floor. It was more than just sensation. It was a flood. Images, sounds, emotions, none of them his. He saw the view from a high-rise office, the city spread out below like a circuit board. He felt a surge of professional pride while looking at a complex financial spreadsheet that he, Julian Croft, couldn't possibly comprehend. He experienced a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy while laughing with a group of women at a loud, trendy cocktail bar. And then there were the arguments, a passionate, furious row with a handsome, square-jawed man. The man's face was blurry, like a photograph slightly out of focus, but the raw emotion of the memory was staggeringly real. Julian felt a lump form in his own throat, the ghost of unshed tears stinging his eyes. He felt the woman's righteous anger, her sense of betrayal. It was an intimacy so profound it felt like a violation. He fought back. He recited the details of his forged identity. Alex Mercer, born in Dayton, Ohio, parents deceased, high school graduate, no living relatives. He traced the lines of his own face in the mirror, the short brown hair, the tired eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. This was him. This was his life. The rest was just a concussion. It was confabulation. But the memories were too specific, too sensory, too real. They felt less like inventions and more like echoes of a life already lived. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach. Was he going mad? Was his meticulously constructed identity, his very mind, starting to unravel? One afternoon, desperate for a distraction, he sat at his laptop, intending to lose himself in mindless web browsing. As his fingers hovered over the keyboard, another flash hit him, stronger than ever before. It was the memory of the crimson nails again, flying across a keyboard identical to his own. He saw a password being typed, each keystroke a clear, distinct motion. SV-Trident-78. It was gibberish to him, a random string of characters his broken brain had cooked up. Yet he felt a strange, undeniable compulsion. His hands moved with a will of their own, his fingers tapping out the sequence into the search engine bar. He hit enter. The screen filled with results. His breath caught in his chest. The top result was a news article published just 3 days ago. The headline read, "Tragic accident claims life of promising financial analyst." Beneath it was a photograph of a smiling, vibrant woman with intelligent eyes and a confident smile. Her name was Sarah Vance. The article stated she had died from a fall in her luxury condo building, the very same one he had collapsed in front of. The police suspected it was an accident, a tragic misstep. And next to her in the photo, with his arm draped possessively around her shoulders, was the handsome, square-jawed man from the memory. The caption identified him, Mark Peterson, CEO of Trident Capital and Sarah Vance's boss. Julian stared at the screen, a cold dread seeping into his bones. His mind wasn't inventing memories, it was replaying them, and they belonged to a dead woman. The discovery of Sarah Vance's identity didn't stop the flood, it opened the dam. The memories, once fragmented and confusing, now had a name, a face. They began to coalesce, to form a narrative. Julian was no longer just experiencing random sensations, he was living snippets of Sarah's life. And with her memories came her skills. He was watching the financial news one evening, a habit he'd picked up to blend in, when the anchor started discussing a complex corporate merger. Normally, the jargon would have washed over him, derivatives, leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers. But tonight, it was different. As the ticker tape scrolled across the bottom of the screen, he understood it. He didn't just understand the words, he understood the implications, the strategies, the subtle dance of power and money. He could see the patterns, anticipate the market shifts. It was as if Sarah's decade of experience as a financial analyst had been uploaded directly into his brain. He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights, a profound sense of vertigo washing over him. He knew, with an inexplicable certainty, the exact location of the Trident Capital building in the financial district, a part of the city he had meticulously avoided. He could picture her corner office, the precise arrangement of files on her desk, the view from her window. This wasn't madness. Julian's mind, the mind of a forger, was built on observing and deconstructing layers. He understood pigments, brushstrokes, the subtle aging of canvas, the way a master artist built a reality from nothing. He began to apply that same analytical eye to his own predicament. He wasn't being haunted. A ghost, in the traditional sense, implied a conscious entity, a lingering spirit. This felt different. It was colder, more technical. He developed a theory, a chilling hypothesis born from his unique perspective. He called it the bleed. He reasoned that a person's mind, their consciousness, was a complex web of electrical and chemical data. A violent, traumatic death, like a murder, could theoretically release a massive surge of that energy, a final, desperate broadcast of the self. At the exact moment of Sarah Vance's death, or moments after, he had suffered his own extreme trauma, a severe concussion, in the exact same physical location. His mind, already primed for mimicry and the assumption of false identities, was in a uniquely receptive state. It was like a damaged hard drive being placed next to a powerful, corrupting magnet. He hadn't seen a ghost, his brain had inadvertently downloaded the last data file of a dying soul. The theory was insane, but it was the only one that fit the terrifyingly specific evidence. He was the canvas, and Sarah Vance's life was the paint bleeding through. This new understanding, however, brought no comfort. Because if he had her memories of finance and her favorite perfume, what else did he have? What was on the final, corrupted section of that data file? He got his answer that night. He was jolted awake not by a dream, but by a memory so vivid it felt like it was happening in the present. He was no longer in his bed. He was in a dark, concrete parking garage. The air was cold and smelled of gasoline and dampness. He felt the familiar strain in his calves from the high heels, heard the echo of his own frantic footsteps. He was walking quickly, keys clutched in his hand like a weapon. Then came the emotion, pure and undiluted, fear. It was a primal, heart-stopping terror. The feeling of being watched, of being followed. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He dared a glance over his shoulder. A shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar behind him, moving quickly. He didn't have time to scream. There was a sudden, explosive burst of pain at the back of his skull, a sickening crunch. The world tilted violently, the concrete floor rushing up to meet him. Julian woke up screaming, thrashing in his own sweat-soaked sheets. His hand flew to the back of his head, where the memory of the blow still throbbed with phantom agony. Tears streamed down his face, not his tears, but hers. Her terror was his terror. Her pain was his pain. Sarah Vance's death wasn't an accident, it was murder, and he had just experienced it from the inside. The raw terror of the parking garage memory solidified into a grim certainty. The police had ruled it an accident, but the police didn't have a ghost in their head, the only witness. A strange, compelling sense of responsibility settled over Julian. His life as Alex Mercer was about hiding, about erasing the past. But now, someone else's past was screaming for justice inside his own skull, and he couldn't ignore it. His skills as a forger, the obsessive attention to detail, the ability to observe the unseen, to slip into another persona, were, for the first time, not for hiding, but for hunting. He had to walk in her shoes, literally and figuratively. Guided by the increasingly clear map of memories, he began his investigation. His first stop was her condo building, the Azure, the place where it all began and ended. He stood across the street, the same spot where he'd been hit, and stared up at the gleaming glass tower. He felt a phantom chill, a memory of pride in owning a home there, now tainted with a deep, encroaching dread. The lobby was off limits, still cordoned off with a discreet strip of police tape, but he saw the polished marble floors from her memory and felt the phantom click of her heels. He loitered, observing the flow of residents, mimicking the casual indifference of someone waiting for a ride, his forger's mind absorbing every detail. His next stop was a chic, minimalist restaurant called Verve. A memory flash showed him a specific booth in the back, the dim lighting, the taste of an oaky Chardonnay. He remembered the argument with Mark Peterson here, the controlled fury in Mark's voice, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Julian went inside, took a seat at the bar, and ordered a coffee. He watched the booth, replaying the scene in his mind. The memory was sharpening. He could almost hear the words now. "Can't let you do this, Sarah. It's reckless." Mark's voice, a low hiss. "Reckless? Mark, it's fraud. It's grand larceny. What you did is going to destroy hundreds of lives." Her voice, trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. The conversation had been about a document, something she had found, something she was threatening to expose. A ledger, she had called it. A memory surfaced of her hands trembling as she held a thin, black leather-bound book. The police report, which he'd found online, mentioned no such item. They hadn't known what to look for. The final, most difficult visit was to the parking garage. He found the multi-level structure attached to the Trident Capitol building. Guided by Sarah's spatial memory, he navigated the spiraling ramps down to P4, Section C. He found the spot where she always parked her silver Audi. He stood there in the dim, humming silence, and the memory of her final moments washed over him again, this time with terrifying clarity. He saw the shadow, Mark Peterson's shadow, looming over her. He felt the cold shock of realization in her final second of consciousness. The man she loved was about to kill her. The emotional backlash was so intense, Julian had to lean against a concrete pillar, gasping for air. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was personal. He was carrying her last stand inside him. He had to find that ledger. But where would she hide something so important? He pushed aside his own logic and tried to think like her. She was smart, meticulous, but also sentimental. She wouldn't have used a bank safe deposit box. Mark could have traced that. She would have hidden it somewhere personal, somewhere only she would think of, a place tied to a memory. A new fragment of a memory flickered into life. Sarah as a young girl, sitting in the passenger seat of her father's vintage car. Her father, a grizzled investigative journalist, was showing her a secret compartment he had built under the floor mat to hide sensitive tapes and documents. "Never put your proof where they expected, kiddo," the ghost of her father's voice said in his mind. Julian's heart hammered. Her car, the silver Audi. The police would have impounded it, searched it, and then released it to her next of kin, if she had any. Or perhaps it was still sitting in an evidence lot. He knew, with the certainty of Sarah's own memory, that the ledger wasn't in the glove box or the trunk. It was in a place her father had taught her to create, a place no one would ever think to look. He now had a target. He had to get to her car. Mark Peterson had built his empire on a lie. From the outside, he was a titan of finance, a charismatic leader whose face graced the covers of business magazines. On the inside, he was a forger, just like Julian. But where Julian forged art, replicating beauty, Mark forged reality, creating an illusion of profit and stability out of thin air, all built on a foundation of massive, systemic fraud. He was a master of surfaces, and the murder of Sarah Vance had been his most critical act of preservation. He had been meticulous, staging it to look like a tragic, accidental fall. The police had bought it, the investigation was closed, and he was safe. Or so he thought. His first inkling that something was wrong came from a routine security report, a flag for an individual loitering outside the Azure for an extended period, the same day the police tape came down. He dismissed it. Then, a few days later, a security alert from his own building's garage. The same individual, identified by facial recognition software as Alex Mercer, was seen on camera on the exact level, in the exact section, where Sarah used to park. Coincidence was a luxury Mark Peterson didn't believe in. He ran a background check on Alex Mercer. The results were a masterpiece of blandness. A transient worker from Ohio, no family, no connections, no criminal record. A ghost, a nobody. So why was this nobody suddenly tracing the last steps of Sarah Vance's life? Mark was a predator, and his instincts told him this ghost was a threat. He decided to send a message. Julian came home from his shift to find a single white lily lying on his doormat. Its petals were bruised and starting to wilt. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a funeral flower. The message was clear. Stop digging. The threat had an unintended effect. It didn't just scare Julian, it angered Sarah. He felt her fury rise in him, a hot, defiant wave. Who was this man to threaten them? To think he could get away with murder and then intimidate her into silence? Her into silence? The lines were blurring. He found himself pacing his apartment, his posture straighter, his gestures sharper, more decisive. He caught his reflection in the dark window, and for a split second saw the ghost of her determined expression superimposed over his own. The bleed was becoming an overwrite. He was losing himself. The quiet, cautious Julian Croft was being subsumed by the passionate, fearless Sarah Vance. Her memories were no longer just echoes. They were impulses, emotions, even speech patterns. He found himself using phrases he'd never used before, tapping his fingers impatiently in a rhythm that was hers, not his. The next day at work, he logged into his work terminal to check his schedule. His desktop background, usually a default gray, had been changed. It was now a high-resolution photograph of the parking garage at Trident Capital, taken from a security camera. In the corner of the image, his own grainy figure was visible, standing by Sarah's parking space. There was no mistaking the message this time. I see you. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of Sarah's anger. Julian's own survival instinct screamed at him to run, to pack a bag and disappear again, to create a new forgery in a new city. Mark Peterson was not some disgruntled art collector. He was a powerful, ruthless executive who had already killed once. But as he stood there, his heart pounding, a stronger feeling took hold. It was Sarah's resolve. She had died trying to expose this man. Her last conscious thoughts were of justice. To run now would be to let him win, to let her die in vain. The ghost in his head would not be silenced. He was trapped between two forgers, and the only way out was to finish what Sarah had started. Getting to Sarah's car was a high-stakes performance. Julian used his newfound understanding of financial systems and a burner phone to pose as a junior associate from an insurance firm, calling the city impound lot with a flurry of official-sounding jargon and case numbers. He spun a convincing tale about a final vehicle inspection for a closed claim. It was a classic forger's gambit. Create a pretext so believable that no one bothers to look at the details. It worked. They gave him a 15-minute window. The impound lot was a graveyard of steel and shattered glass. Guided by Sarah's memory, he found her silver Audi squeezed between a wrecked minivan and a rusted pickup. Inside, the car still held the faint scent of her perfume. It was like stepping into a tomb. He fought a wave of her sadness, a memory of singing along to the radio on a sunny afternoon drive, and focused on the task. He pulled up the passenger side floor mat. Just as the memory of her father had shown her, there was a small, almost invisible seam in the carpet. He worked his fingers into it and pulled. A square section of the floorboard lifted away, revealing a shallow, custom-built compartment, and nestled inside was a slim, black leather-bound ledger. The moment his fingers touched the cool leather, the dam broke. It wasn't a flash this time. It was a full, sustained immersion. He was no longer Julian Croft in an impound lot. He was Sarah Vance, living her final, terrifying day. He felt the morning sun on his face as he left his condo, the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was in his office, confronting Mark, the ledger a heavy weight in his briefcase. He felt the sting of betrayal as Mark pleaded, then threatened. He relived the tense lunch at Verve, the argument, the moment he realized Mark would never listen to reason. He experienced the drive to the parking garage, the growing sense of dread, the feeling of being hunted. The entire sequence from the garage played out in horrifying first-person detail, the frantic search for his keys, the sound of the footsteps behind him, Mark's voice, cold and final. "You shouldn't have done this, Sarah." And then the blow, the blinding pain, the taste of blood, the cold concrete against his cheek, and the final, fading thought that echoed through the psychic void and into his soul. He can't get away with this. Julian snapped back to himself, kneeling on the floor of the Audi, gasping for breath. The ledger was clutched in his white-knuckled fist. But something had fundamentally shifted. The line between himself and Sarah had dissolved. His own memories of painting, of hiding, of being Julian Croft felt thin and distant, like stories he'd been told about a stranger. Sarah's fear, her determination, her all-consuming need for justice, that was what felt real. The override was nearly complete. He had the proof. The ledger was filled with meticulously recorded evidence of Mark's offshore accounts, illegal transfers, and the entire fraudulent scheme that propped up Trident Capital. He could take it to the police. But a memory of Sarah's journalist father echoed in his mind. Powerful men bury evidence. Mark would have an army of lawyers to discredit it, to bury him. No. The police were the second step. The first step had to be public exposure. That's what Sarah, the journalist's daughter, would have wanted. He wasn't just acting for himself anymore. He was the instrument of her will. He had to see this through, for her. The forger had one last masterpiece to create. It would not be on canvas, but on the grand stage of corporate media. Using a secure email account from a public library, Julian, or the being that was now Julian and Sarah, leaked a single damning page of the ledger to a notoriously aggressive financial blogger. It was just enough to be an appetizer, a hint of a massive scandal at Trident Capital, but not enough to reveal the full scope of the evidence. He created a spark and then sat back to watch the fire spread. Within hours, Trident's stock began to tremble. The blog post went viral. Mark Peterson was cornered. He had to get the ledger. The next anonymous email came from Julian, proposing a meeting. The real ledger in exchange for a clean slate and a guarantee of safety. The location was Julian's choice, the central atrium of the city's Museum of Modern Art, a public place, flooded with witnesses, but with quiet, echoing corners perfect for a tense conversation. It was a place Julian, the art lover, knew intimately, and a place Sarah, the sophisticated professional, would have felt at home. Mark Peterson arrived, flanked by a lawyer who looked more like a bodyguard. He was the picture of confidence, a man used to solving problems with his checkbook or his fists. He saw Alex Mercer standing by a large abstract sculpture, a quiet, unassuming man who looked utterly out of his depth. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble," Mark began, his voice a low, intimidating purr. "But I'm a reasonable man. Name your price." But the man who looked back at him wasn't Alex Mercer. The eyes that met his held the cold, unwavering fire of Sarah Vance. "There is no price, Mark," Julian said, and his voice was steady, imbued with a confidence that wasn't his own. He began to speak, not as a blackmailer, but as a ghost. He referenced the nickname Mark had for Sarah, Vancy, a detail no one else could know. He described the specific bottle of wine they had shared on their anniversary, the one she'd spilled on the white carpet. He recounted, word for word, the final heated exchange from Verve. "She told you it would destroy lives," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She believed in you, she loved you, and you murdered her for a book of numbers." Mark's composure finally cracked. His face went pale, a mask of disbelief and rage. "Who are you?" he hissed, taking a step forward. "How could you possibly know that?" "She told me," Julian replied simply. This was the forger's gambit. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a black, leather-bound book. He held it out. "This is what you want. This is what you killed her for." Mark's arrogance, his obsession with destroying the final piece of evidence, took over. He snatched the ledger from Julian's hand. "Fool," he gloated, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "You think you can play games with me? I built an empire. She was just a speed bump. I killed her, and I would do it again to protect what's mine." He opened the ledger. The pages were blank. It was a perfect, empty replica, a forgery. Mark looked up, his face a canvas of confusion and fury. Julian gave a small, sad smile. "Classic investigative journalist trick," he said, nodding subtly towards the lapel of his jacket. "My father taught me that. But it was Sarah's father, not his." From the museum's entrance, two plainclothes detectives, whom Julian had alerted with the full ledger an hour before, began walking towards them. Mark's confession, his gloating admission of murder, had been captured perfectly by the micro-camera hidden in Julian's coat button. The arrest of Mark Peterson was a media firestorm. The story of the century, a titan of industry brought down by a mountain of evidence provided by an anonymous whistleblower. The corporate scandal he had killed to protect unfolded on every news channel, and the name Sarah Vance was finally spoken with the reverence of a hero, not the pity of a victim. She got her justice. For Julian, the aftermath was silent. As the news reports confirmed Mark's indictment and the collapse of his fraudulent empire, a strange quiet descended within his mind. The constant, intrusive pressure of Sarah's memories, the anger, the fear, the burning need for retribution, began to recede. Their purpose had been served. The psychic bleed, the violent torrent of another's life, slowed to a trickle, then stopped. He was left alone in his own head for the first time in weeks. But it was a different head, a different mind. The invasive, terrifying presence was gone, but she had left echoes behind. He would walk past a coffee shop and feel a phantom craving for a dark roast he'd never liked. A song on the radio would trigger a faint, ghostly pang of a happy memory that wasn't his. They were no longer intrusive visions, but quiet, melancholic reminders of the woman whose life had crashed into his. He was still Julian Croft, the forger, but the foundation of his identity had been irrevocably altered. He could never go back to a life of hiding and imitation for profit. He had used his unique skills not to deceive, but to uncover a truth. He had performed for a purpose greater than himself. With Sarah's residual knowledge of financial systems now a permanent part of him, and with the Alex Mercer identity now useless, he had a choice to make. He didn't disappear. Instead, he forged a new life, a real one. He used his anonymity and his new, bizarre skill set to create a new identity as a freelance forensic accountant, a white hat consultant who specialized in finding the very kind of fraud Mark Peterson had perfected. He was a man who now used his innate ability to spot a fake to expose the truth. Months later, he was living in a new city under his own name, Julian Croft. The paranoia was gone, replaced by a quiet vigilance. He was walking through a park on a crisp autumn afternoon. The sun was warm, and the leaves were turning shades of gold and crimson. He saw a young woman sitting on a bench, laughing at something on her phone. For a fleeting moment, her profile, the way she held her head, reminded him of Sarah. He felt it then, the faintest, most delicate echo of a memory. It wasn't the terror or the anger, it was a whisper of Sarah's love for Mark, from a time before the lies and the betrayal. A flash of a happy weekend, a shared joke, a moment of genuine affection. He felt a pang of sadness, not for his own trauma, but for her loss, for the life she never got to live. He took a deep breath, the feeling passing like a cloud drifting across the sun. He was a man with two sets of memories, a canvas painted over with the life of another. And for the first time, he was at peace with both. He walked on, his future an unwritten page, a blank canvas waiting for a new, authentic stroke. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.